Senator from Alaska.
Mr. President, I want to compliment my good friend from South Dakota, Chairman of the Commerce Committee, for coming down here and leading the discussion on a really important topic that, to be honest, we are not talking about nearly enough in the Senate, and certainly the Obama administration is not talking about nearly enough, and that's the importance of our economy. Now, I was on the floor a couple weeks ago, and I made a prediction. I said that there's going to be big economic news coming out, and my prediction was that nobody in the administration was going to talk about it, and nobody and our friends in the media were going to talk about it. Unfortunately, my prediction came true. The big news is what Chairman Thune said, is that last quarter we grew at 0.5% GDP growth. We essentially didn't grow. Didn't grow. The great American economy, the thing that's made us great as a country for 200 plus years, just stalled. And nobody talked about it. The Obama administration didn't talk about it. The media didn't talk about it. So when we talk about gross domestic product, Mr. President, this is essentially the health of the economy, right? It's the measure of opportunity in America. And unfortunately, what we saw last quarter was additional proof that the Obama administration's on this critical issue, economic growth for our citizens, is one of the worst in U.S. history. And it's not just me saying that, Mr. President. People should take a look at these numbers. These are numbers actually from the administration, other administrations. This just looks at recent economic growth, last 50 years, starting with President Kennedy's administration. But as my colleague from South Dakota said, you know, the average growth for the United States in our 200-plus year history has been about 3.7% GDP growth. Okay, so you look at this chart, and this is very bipartisan, of course. Almost 4% GDP growth, the average for the country. It's really what's made us great, strong. You look at this chart, it shows the ups and downs. This red line here is 3% GDP growth, which is considered pretty good, not great, but pretty good. We certainly should be targeting that. Look at the Obama administration right here in the corner. It's never even hit 3% GDP growth. Not once, not even in one quarter, ever. What you're seeing right here in the almost 10 years of President Obama, relative to any other administration, Democrat or Republican, Johnson, Nixon, even Carter, Reagan, Clinton, real strong growth there. The Obama administration has been clearly, by any measure, a lost decade of economic growth. A lost decade of economic growth. And unfortunately, Mr. President, you don't hear the administration talking about it at all. Now, you can understand why. It's an abysmal record. But the truth of the matter is, if you look back in history, and we had 0.5% GDP growth, we weren't growing, and that news came out, whether it was a Democrat or Republican administration, almost every time something like that, the Secretary of the Treasury would have come out and said, "Don't worry, America. We know you're hurting. We have a plan." The Secretary of Commerce, "We have ideas on growing the economy. We know that 0.5% GDP growth, essentially flat growth, no growth, is not the historical tradition of America." Cabinet members in any administration, historically, all of these would have come out and told us, "We know it's a problem, and here's how we're going to fix it." 2 weeks ago, when this news came out, we heard nothing from this administration. Nothing. Now, when they do talk about the economy, it's typically three types of responses. One is, my colleague from South Dakota mentioned, there's this kind of talk in Washington about the, quote, new normal. The new normal. In my view, one of the most dangerous phrases being bannered about in D.C. Because the new normal says, hey, we know America's been growing at this robust rate, almost 4% GDP growth for most of our history, but there's new factors. We should not expect that anymore. Heck, we shouldn't even expect 3%, where the red line is. Let's just dumb down our expectations. So they talk about the new normal. New normal should be about 1.5%, 2% GDP growth, maybe. And the people in Washington are telling the rest of the country, you guys should be satisfied with that. Well, we shouldn't be. That's a surrender. That's a surrender of the American dream. So that's one response, the new normal. The other thing the president has done for a while, but he can't do anymore, unfortunately, he's looked around the world and said, well, hey, at least we're growing better than Europe or Japan or Brazil. Really, the only measure that actually matters, it's not another country. How do we stack up against America? But he doesn't want to talk about that, so he talks about Europe. Well, he can't talk about Europe anymore because we're growing at 0.5% GDP growth, and Europe last quarter grew at 2.2%. Not great, but certainly better than ours. So obviously they have to get rid of that talking point. So the third thing they do is just actually come out and try to tell us, hey, you know what? You're actually doing better. I know you're feeling horrible and your wages haven't gone up, but you are doing better. Trust me. So the president recently, in a New York Times article, said that he kind of lamented, looking back, that he didn't sell all the great stuff he was doing better on the economy. He didn't sell it better. Well, I don't think he needs to sell it. Most people feel it. It's not great. But he even said, we're absolutely better off today than 7 years ago, and those who say otherwise are not leveling with you. They're not telling the truth. By almost every economic measure, we are significantly better off. It's a quote 2 weeks ago by the president. I think it's astounding that the president of the United States is saying that kind of stuff to the American people because it's simply not true. Let me provide some facts, Mr. President, and the story to tell of a country that in almost every economic measure is actually worse off than we were when the Obama administration started. So in the past 8 years, the labor force participation rate has slid to its lowest measure since the mid-1970s. That's essentially people who have quit looking for a job because they can't find one. The percentage of Americans below the poverty line in the last 8 years has grown. According to the most recent census data, it's up almost 4%. Real median household incomes, what people are bringing home to their homes, in the last 8 years has declined from $54,900 to $53,600. Food stamp participation since the president took office has actually soared, up by almost 40%. And the percentage of Americans who own homes, a marker of the promise of the American dream, is down 5%. This is all in the 8 years, 7.5 years of President Obama. The late Vice President Hubert Humphrey once said, quote, propaganda to be effective must be believed. To be believed, it must be credible. To be credible, it must be true. Mr. President, no matter how much this administration uses soaring speeches or articles from media sources that have been favorably disposed of them, or clever tweets insisting that the economy is doing well, it simply is not. These are the facts. These are the facts. And Americans know it. Americans know it. We are spending more on housing and food. Wages are stagnant. Many, as I mentioned, have given up looking for good jobs. Some are questioning the ability at all to put their kids through college. Now, what's interesting, Mr. President, is Washington, D.C. is doing fine. When you grow the government the way we have in the last 8 years, this part of the country actually never had a recession. And it's now one of the richest places in America, right here in Washington. And that's why so many in the D.C. press corps weren't writing about this. The president says the economy's doing well, so must be doing well. But I think the good news is, Mr. President, that even now the media is starting to pick up on this. Because the problem is so pervasive. And in this election season, this is what we're hearing Americans talk about. Here's a heading from a recent Atlantic article. Quote, "The lonely poverty of America's white working class." Another from the same publication, quote, "The resurrection of America's slums." Here's one from another publication, "Poverty in America, the deepening crisis." Recently, there have been numerous articles about how poverty leads to addiction and higher mortality rates. The New Yorker had a recent piece entitled, "Life Expectancy Inequality Grows in America." The Washington Post is now starting to do some stories, heartbreaking stories about poverty, death, and economic despair in our great country. And just today in the Post, talking about the recent West Virginia primary election, the Washington Post stated, quote, "Many poor, less educated Americans who have been left behind in the 21st century, the ones who have seen their wages stagnate, their opportunities for upward mobility disappear, and their life expectancies shorter, are looking to disrupt the status quo that has not worked for them," unquote. So, Mr. President, what does all this mean? What does this mean for our great country, our citizens? One indication is that poll after poll, Americans are telling us that they're running out of hope. 65% of Americans now believe that the country's on the wrong track. That's not surprising. Never hit 3% GDP growth in the lost decade that we had this past 10 years. The vast majority of Americans don't believe that their kids are going to be better off than they are. They are telling us that the quality that has made America great, the quality that is in the DNA of the United States, and that's progress, is losing out to this idea of the new normal. A new normal where our children are not going to be better off than we are, where we can't grow the economy. But, Mr. President, the American dream is all about progress, and we need to remember that. We can't settle for another lost decade of economic growth. We can't settle for stagnation. Mr. President, a number of my colleagues, particularly on the other side of the aisle, come down the Senate floor, and I have respect for everybody in this great body. And they talk about the moral imperatives that they believe are important. Moral imperative on this topic, moral imperative on the other topic. But they rarely talk about the moral imperative of growth and opportunity. And to me, that is the biggest moral imperative we have, with the exception of national defense, in this body. It is a moral imperative to recognize that we have experienced a lost decade of economic growth. We have a moral imperative to talk about the pervasive poverty, what that does to our citizens, how it creates holes in the social fabric that hold us together, and how when our own citizens fall through those holes, a piece of all of us goes with them, because although we are individuals, we are all Americans together. We have a moral imperative to tell our fellow citizens that working together, we don't have to accept this, the new normal. And we have the moral imperative to lift up American workers with policies that actually help them. Mr. President, I was shocked, like most Americans, when presidential candidate Hillary Clinton said that under her administration, she would put coal miners out of work. Here's the quote. Quote, "We are going to put a lot of coal miners and coal businesses out of business," unquote. That is shocking. That is shocking. Think about that. Now, I come from a state where there's a lot of mining. These are great jobs. These are important jobs. These are important for the national economy of America. To have a candidate say that she intends to put coal miners out of work is part of the problem. Part of the problem. And as Senator Thune mentioned, the other part of the problem is that Washington has not become it's no longer a partner in opportunity for coal miners, for workers, for growing the economy, but it's become an obstacle. Mr. President, we have to do a lot to get this economy moving. My colleague from South Dakota just mentioned a number of ideas. We're going to be on the floor talking about a number of these ideas. The moral imperative to provide economic opportunity and hope for Americans. One thing for certain that we have to do is get control of a federal government that wants to regulate every single aspect of our lives and economy. This is a chart that shows how federal rules from this town just go straight up. Every year, there's more. As a matter of fact, the Obama administration is going to be the first in U.S. history to have proposed in a single year 80,000 pages of new federal regs. 80,000 pages. If you think that that is going to help the coal miners or other Americans or working class families with hope and opportunity, that's not the right solution. What we need is less government, more economic freedom, and the truth about what's going on in this great economy of ours, in our great country. And that's what we're going to continue to do, Mr. President. I yield the floor.